The opioid epidemic gripping the United States did not emerge overnight. Its roots trace back to the 1990s and early 2000s, a period when pharmaceutical giants aggressively marketed powerful painkillers as safe and non-addictive. Driven by the promise of extraordinary profits, these companies deployed sophisticated campaigns to sway doctors, patients, and regulators. Warnings about the addictive nature of these drugs were downplayed or outright ignored. This era of unchecked corporate ambition created conditions ripe for widespread misuse, devastating families and communities across the country. As the crisis unfolded, it became clear that the pursuit of profit had paved the way for a public health catastrophe of historic proportions. Pharmaceutical companies like Purdue Pharma unleashed high-pressure marketing campaigns targeting doctors and healthcare providers throughout the late 1990s and 2000s. Sales representatives downplayed the risk of addiction, while touting opioids like OxyContin as a safe, effective solution for chronic pain. Advertisements and educational materials often exaggerated the benefits and omitted critical warnings. This strategy, detailed by the New York Times, fueled a dramatic rise in prescriptions, laying the foundation for the crisis that followed. To further drive sales, pharmaceutical firms boldly asserted that opioids carried a low risk of addiction. They often referenced a brief, flawed letter published in a medical journal as proof, while ignoring its lack of depth or scientific rigor. Marketing literature and educational materials repeated these misleading claims, shaping both prescriber and public opinion. According to the Mayo Clinic proceedings, this misinformation played a critical role in fueling overprescription and the eventual explosion in opioid dependence. The pharmaceutical industry used lucrative incentives to encourage doctors to prescribe opioids, including paid speaking engagements, lavish dinners, and consulting fees. These perks created a powerful financial motive for physicians to favor opioid prescriptions, sometimes over safer alternatives. As highlighted by ProPublica, this widespread practice blurred ethical boundaries and fostered a culture of overprescription, accelerating the spread of opioid addiction across the nation. Pharmaceutical companies worked diligently to minimize the perceived dangers of opioids in their communications with government regulators. By presenting selective data and underreporting adverse effects, they delayed the implementation of stricter controls and oversight. This strategic approach, as reported by The Guardian, allowed opioid sales to flourish unchecked, further fueling the epidemic before meaningful intervention could take place. Big Pharma's influence extended deep into the scientific community. Companies funded research designed to produce favorable outcomes, often shaping study protocols and selectively publishing positive results. Some researchers were pressured to interpret data in ways that supported the widespread use of opioids for pain management. According to JAMA Network, this manipulation not only misled healthcare professionals but also undermined public trust in medical science, compounding the opioid crisis. Pharmaceutical companies tailored their marketing to rural and economically distressed regions, knowing these communities often lacked access to comprehensive healthcare and addiction resources. Aggressive sales tactics and direct outreach to local providers increased opioid availability in areas already struggling with poverty and unemployment. As reported by NPR, such targeting led to disproportionately high rates of addiction and overdose, deepening the crisis among America's most vulnerable populations. Major drug distributors shipped staggering amounts of opioid pills to small towns, often far exceeding what local populations could reasonably use for medical treatment. This unchecked flow overwhelmed communities and left pharmacies stocked with more pills than people. According to the Washington Post, the oversupply made diversion and misuse almost inevitable, intensifying addiction rates and straining already limited local resources. To protect their profits, pharmaceutical companies invested millions in lobbying efforts aimed at blocking or weakening opioid-related regulations. Lobbyists worked closely with lawmakers to shape policies, delay enforcement, and undermine attempts to impose tighter controls on opioid distribution. As detailed by Reuters, these actions allowed Big Pharma to maintain the status quo, enabling continued overproduction and distribution even as the scope of the epidemic became clear. Even as reports of opioid misuse and overdose surged, pharmaceutical companies dismissed mounting evidence of harm. Internal documents later revealed a consistent pattern of prioritizing sales targets over patient safety. Rather than addressing growing red flags, executives chose to protect profits and expand markets. According to CNN, this willful ignorance helped transform a manageable problem into a national catastrophe. As the crisis worsened, pharmaceutical companies frequently deflected responsibility by blaming patients for misusing prescription opioids. Instead of addressing their own aggressive marketing and distribution practices, they emphasized abuse by individuals. This narrative, highlighted by Stat News, allowed companies to avoid accountability and continue profiting while communities suffered the devastating consequences of addiction. When faced with lawsuits, many pharmaceutical companies opted for financial settlements rather than admitting any wrongdoing. These payouts, while substantial, often represented only a fraction of their profits and rarely included meaningful penalties for executives or systemic change. As reported by NPR, these settlements allowed firms to avoid public accountability while continuing business operations with minimal disruption. As regulatory scrutiny intensified in the United States, pharmaceutical companies began to expand opioid sales overseas. They introduced similar marketing strategies in international markets, often downplaying addiction risks and promoting opioids for chronic pain. According to the Los Angeles Times, these actions threatened to replicate the U.S. epidemic abroad, risking a new wave of addiction and public health crises in vulnerable countries. Through relentless promotion and education campaigns, Big Pharma normalized the routine prescription of high-dose opioids, embedding the belief that effective pain management required medication above all else. Doctors were encouraged to treat pain as a fifth vital sign, often with little regard for alternative therapies. As detailed by Harvard Public Health, this shift in medical culture fueled overprescribing, leaving millions exposed to the risks of addiction and dependency. To protect their market share, pharmaceutical companies actively minimized the role of non-opioid therapies for pain management. Alternative treatments, such as physical therapy, acupuncture, and behavioral interventions, were often dismissed or ignored in promotional materials. This approach, as explained by the NIH, left both doctors and patients with limited awareness of safer options, further entrenching opioids as the default solution for chronic pain. The massive influx of prescription opioids into communities created a surplus that fueled diversion and illicit sales. Pills intended for legitimate use were frequently resold or stolen, feeding a growing black market. As access to prescription opioids tightened, many users turned to heroin and synthetic opioids like fentanyl. According to the CDC, this shift dramatically increased overdose deaths and intensified the nation's opioid crisis. The relentless pursuit of immediate profits led pharmaceutical companies to overlook the devastating, long-term effects of opioid proliferation. Concerns about addiction, community destabilization, and rising healthcare costs were routinely sidelined in favor of quarterly earnings. As reported by The Atlantic, this short-sightedness sacrificed public health for private gain and left society shouldering the immense burden of the opioid epidemic. The relentless pursuit of immediate profits led pharmaceutical companies to overlook the devastating, long-term effects of opioid proliferation. Concerns about addiction, community destabilization, and rising healthcare costs were routinely sidelined in favor of quarterly earnings. As reported by The Atlantic, this short-sightedness sacrificed public health for private gain and left society shouldering the immense burden of the opioid epidemic. This video is for informational purposes only and does not constitute medical or legal advice. If you or someone you know is affected by opioid use, please consult qualified healthcare or legal professionals for guidance. Stay informed, ask questions, and advocate for transparency and accountability in healthcare decisions that impact our communities.